There's a certain kind of silence that only comes after the chaos, not the silence of a quiet room, but the silence of a soul. After it's done screaming in the dark, you wake up before the sun rises, emails waiting, messages blinking. Your to-do list is already shouting before your feet hit the floor, somewhere between your first cup of coffee and the second. You forget to breathe, and then comes the weight, not a physical one, no, but the weight of everything you haven't said, everything you haven't done, every expectation you didn't choose but still carry. This isn't just your story, it's the story of millions, chasing life as if it were a finish line, only to realize we've been running in circles, inside our own minds. We say we want peace, we crave simplicity, but our thoughts, they pull us in every direction except inward. We think if we just manage things better, work harder, push more, achieve faster, then maybe, just maybe, the chaos will quiet down. But it never does, because the burden was never outside, it was always in the mind. What if I told you the heaviest things we carry are invisible: guilt, regret, fear of missing out, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being enough. We carry those around like invisible backpacks, stuffing in a little more every time someone says, "You should do more. You should be more. You should already be there by now." But no one tells us this. The path to a meaningful life isn't about adding more. It's about carrying less. It's about subtracting. And when the mind gets lighter, strangely, life becomes deeper. Not deeper with complexity, deeper with presence, deeper with clarity, deeper with being truly alive. There's an old Buddhist parable. A traveler came to the Buddha. Weary and troubled, he said, "I have so many problems in life. My health, my relationships, my work. Please help me." The Buddha replied, "I can't help you get rid of your 83 problems, but I can help you with the 84th. The man asked, "What's the 84th? The Buddha smiled. "It's the belief that you shouldn't have any." That's the trap of the modern mind. The belief that life must be perfect before we can rest, that everything must be solved before we can breathe easy. That peace is somewhere out there, just beyond the next achievement or the next fix. But what if peace isn't found in solving problems, but in not being owned by them? What if the depth we're seeking doesn't come from controlling everything, but from letting go? We are, all of us, carrying too much. And not just our own worries. We carry the weight of opinions, the judgments of strangers, the curated lives we scroll past on screens. Comparison becomes our compass, and validation becomes our drug. But the high never lasts, because external worth is a leaky cup. No matter how much you pour in, it keeps draining out. What we long for isn't more noise, but stillness, not more possessions, but space, not more followers, but meaning. There's a quiet wisdom in Buddhist thought. That attachment is the root of suffering. But attachment doesn't always look like clinging to people or things. Sometimes it's clinging to ideas of who we think we should be, of how life should turn out. We grasp for certainty, for control, and end up suffocating under the weight of our own expectations. It's like holding onto a burning coal, thinking it will light the way, but really it's only burning our hands. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing not to suffer. It means making space, so life can actually breathe through us. Ask yourself, what would my life feel like if my mind were lighter, not empty, just unburdened, uncluttered, free? What would change? If I stopped carrying what no longer belongs to me, maybe we'd finally hear the silence beneath the noise. Maybe we'd finally see beauty in the ordinary. Maybe we'd finally feel that we are enough, even in stillness, especially in stillness. This is not about escaping life. It's about entering it fully, deeply, but without the weight, because when the mind is light, Every moment becomes a doorway into depth, into presence, into peace. It's in that space where wisdom is born, not from frantic thinking, but from letting go of what clouds the view. So maybe the first step isn't doing more. Maybe the first step is dropping what we were never meant to carry. The pressure, the past, the persona, the perfection, all of it. And maybe then we discover the part of ourselves that was always there, just waiting underneath, still, quiet, clear. Like water, like sky, like freedom. When we begin to let go of the weight, we begin to see the truth, that a lighter mind doesn't float away. It sinks into life more deeply, and from that stillness, something new begins to emerge. Not a new version of you, but the real one. The one that doesn't have to perform, prove, or pretend. Just be, just breathe, just return to the quiet center where depth begins and the journey unfolds. Ready to begin that journey? Let's take the next step. The mind is a miracle. It can imagine galaxies, build bridges, compose symphonies. It can remember the scent of your grandmother's cooking and replay a childhood memory so vividly you forget where you are. But for all its brilliance, the mind can also become a prison with no walls, no guards, just endless thoughts echoing in every direction. And the strangest thing, we're the ones who locked the door and threw away the key. You ever wonder why it feels so heavy up there, even when life around you is fine, even when nothing's wrong? The mind still finds something to worry about. It's like this tireless narrator, commenting on everything, judging everyone, especially you. You should have said that better. Why didn't you do more today? Look at them. They're way ahead of you, thought after thought, layer after layer, until what was once clarity turns into a thick fog, not because life is overwhelming, but because thinking has become overwhelming. In Buddhist thought, the mind is like a wild monkey, jumping from branch to branch, from past to future, from fear to fantasy, rarely still, rarely present. But unlike a monkey in the jungle, this one doesn't tire. It feeds on noise. It thrives on distraction. It's addicted to movement. You check your phone, then your email, then the news, then your calendar, and 5 hours later you ask, why am I so exhausted? The body hasn't even moved, but the mind, it's run a marathon. There's a simple truth no one teaches us growing up, that the mind is not meant to hold everything. It's meant to observe, to reflect, to respond with clarity, not to carry the world like a beast of burden. But we never learned how to set it down. We only learned how to pack it tighter. We carry unresolved arguments from years ago. We carry regrets about who we didn't become. We carry imaginary conversations with people who aren't even listening. It's like walking through life with a full backpack, then wondering why we're so tired. The Buddha described the mind as conditioned. That means it's shaped, molded by habit, perception, belief. And the heaviest habits are often the ones we don't see. Judgment, comparison, self-doubt, craving. These aren't just passing thoughts. They're grooves in the mind, deep neural paths worn down by repetition. We think the same thought 10,000 times, and then assume it must be true. But repetition doesn't equal truth. It only equals familiarity. Let's pause here. Have you ever believed a thought? Just because it was loud, the mind says, you're behind, you're not worthy, you'll never change. And because it's your voice, you trust it. But here's the secret. Not everything the mind says is real. Not everything it says is wise. Not everything it says deserves your belief. The mind speaks in echoes, many of them from a past that's no longer here. So why is the mind so heavy? Because we treat every thought like it's sacred. Because we think awareness means control. Because we never learned how to sit with discomfort without trying to fix it. The truth, The mind is heavy because it's full of resistance. We resist what happened. We resist what might happen. We resist how we feel. We resist being here. And the more we resist, the tighter we grip. The tighter we grip, the more we suffer. That's the law of the mental world. What we resist persists. There's a Zen teaching that says, let your thoughts come and go, just don't serve them tea. You don't have to fight your thoughts. You don't have to chase them away. You just have to stop entertaining them. Like honored guests, let them knock. Let them leave. Don't build them a throne in your head. The lightness we seek isn't found in controlling the mind. It's found in understanding its nature. So what is the nature of the mind? Its movement, its impermanence. It's like a river, never the same twice. But the problem is we try to make it a still lake. We want it to stay peaceful, predictable, still. But rivers aren't meant to freeze. They're meant to flow. When we try to control every twist and turn, we're not in harmony with life. We're in conflict with reality, and that conflict is where the heaviness comes from. There's a deeper layer too. We fear the stillness underneath the mind. Because if we stop thinking, who are we? If we stop running, what will catch up? But beneath all that mental noise is a clarity we've forgotten, a spaciousness we once knew as children, before we were taught to always be doing, always be achieving, always be more. That space is still there, still untouched, still yours to begin finding it again. We don't need to silence the mind. We need to relate to it differently. Watch your thoughts like clouds. Name them gently. Ah, this is fear. This is desire. This is memory. And then let them pass. You're not your thoughts. You're the sky that holds them, and the sky never complains about the weight of passing clouds. That's what the Buddha meant when he spoke of freedom, not freedom from life, but freedom within it, freedom from being owned by thought, freedom from believing every mental storm. And here's where the shift begins. When you stop trying to wrestle with your thoughts, when you stop arguing with the past, when you stop demanding certainty from a world made of change, the weight begins to lift. Not all at once, but breath by breath, like a knot slowly loosening, until one day you realize you're not carrying as much. The noise is still there, but it's no longer loud. The fear is still there, but it doesn't define you. The thoughts come, but they pass through, and in their passing, you begin to see something else, something deeper, something lighter, something that was never heavy to begin with. The nature of the mind isn't the problem. It's our misunderstanding of it. When we stop clinging, stop resisting, stop trying to make it perfect, we make space for peace. And when there's space, life doesn't feel so tight. It feels open, vast, alive. And from there, a new kind of lightness can begin to grow, one that carries you, instead of the other way around. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you realize that the tightness inside you is not because of what's happening out there, but because of what you're holding in here. A clenched thought, a buried grudge, a dream that never became real, a fear that you've worn so long it feels like skin. And in that moment, you understand something vital. The pain doesn't just come from life. It comes from the grip. The tighter you hold, the heavier it gets. So maybe the first real step toward peace isn't pushing forward. It's letting go. Letting go. Two simple words, but not always so simple to live. We want to let go. We say we've let go. But deep inside, we're still clinging to what they said, to who we used to be, to the hope that something could have turned out differently. We hold it all like sacred artifacts, as if letting go means forgetting, as if releasing means losing. But here's the truth most of us don't want to hear. You can't fly if your hands are full of stones. There's a story of a monk crossing a river. He carries a bundle on his back, his belongings, his tools, his memories. Halfway across, the water rises. His footing becomes unsure, and suddenly he's struggling to stay afloat. He has a choice: drop the bundle or drown. He hesitates, it's all he owns. But if he doesn't let go, he won't make it to the other side, so he drops it, and with empty hands, he moves forward, lighter, freer, alive. That's the paradox, isn't it? The very things we hold to feel secure are often the things that sink us. We hold onto identities that no longer serve us. We replay pain that no longer belongs in the present. We cling to people who have already walked away, not because they still love us, but because the story feels unfinished. But the truth is, closure isn't something they give you. It's something you give yourself. When you decide that peace matters more than answers, letting go doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you forget. It means you choose freedom over friction, presence over pain, lightness over loyalty to what no longer lives. In Buddhism, this is called upadana, grasping, clinging, attachment. It's one of the roots of suffering, but the opposite isn't apathy. It's upekkha, equanimity, a state of inner balance, where you still feel, but you no longer fuse yourself to every rise and fall. You watch the wave come, you feel it, but you don't drown in it. So how do we actually begin? Letting go isn't a grand gesture. It doesn't always start with fireworks or tears. Sometimes it starts small, almost invisible, like exhaling just a little more deeply, like not replying to a message that would only stir up old pain, like sitting with a difficult emotion and not trying to fix it. It begins by noticing. What are you holding that's holding you back? What belief? What resentment? What expectation? And the question that follows is even more powerful. Who would I be without this? Not numb, not cold, but empty in the way a bowl is empty. Ready, open, clear. There's a saying in Zen, let go or be dragged. And many of us, truthfully, we've been dragged for years by the story that says we're not enough, by the version of success someone else wrote for us, by the need to always be right or always be strong. But every time you let go, you reclaim a piece of your spirit. Every time you release a false layer, you return closer to your true self, that self beneath the noise, that self that doesn't need fixing, only uncovering. Maybe today's the day you put something down. Maybe not everything, but one thing, a judgment, a pressure, a memory that's grown too sharp. Let it fall. Let it soften. You don't have to carry it to prove you survived it. You survived it. Now let yourself be free of it. There's a deep, beautiful teaching from the Buddha. You only lose what you cling to. When we grasp, we suffer. But when we release, we begin to trust life again. We begin to move in rhythm with impermanence, instead of fearing it, because all things change, all forms dissolve, even the pain you're feeling now. It won't last forever, but the spaciousness that remains after letting go, that's where freedom lives. That's where depth begins. Letting go isn't weakness. It's not giving up. It's wisdom. It's clarity. It's the strength to know that not everything belongs in your hands. And sometimes, to grow, we don't need to hold on tighter. We need to hold less. Imagine waking up tomorrow and not carrying the argument from last week, the resentment from last year, the pressure to be perfect. Imagine that. Imagine a lighter step, a quieter mind, a heart not stuffed with yesterday. That future is possible, but it starts now. With one brave, conscious choice to loosen the grip, to open the hand, to trust that life can hold you, even when you're no longer holding everything. And as you soften, you begin to feel something new, or maybe something ancient, a space, a lightness, a breath that reaches all the way in. Not everything has to be held. Not every pain needs a story. Not every loss needs to be carried forever. Some things were meant to pass through you, like wind, like river, like time. Let them go. Let them teach you. Let them free you. And when you do, you'll notice something else, something still, something alive, something ready. Because when the hand lets go, the heart opens, and from there, we begin to discover the next secret of lightness, not just in what we release, but in how we live. We spend so much of our lives trying to hold together a world that was never ours to control. Every detail, every outcome, every moment that doesn't go our way. We tighten our grip just a little more. We plan, predict, overthink, micromanage every inch of the future, as if our effort alone could bend time and fate to our will. But somewhere deep inside, we know the truth. We're not in control, we never were. And the more we fight that truth, the more we suffer, not because of what happens, but because of what we thought should happen. There's a kind of suffering that doesn't come from reality, but from the version of reality we imagined. The job that should have worked out, the person who should have stayed, the life we thought we were supposed to have by now, but none of it was ever guaranteed. It was only a script in the mind, a projection on the blank wall of the future. And when the movie doesn't play the way we pictured it, we blame ourselves, we blame others, we blame life. We tighten our control, and in doing so, we tighten our suffering. There's a story of a man holding onto a rope. As he dangles over a cliff, he's screaming, sweating, terrified, and suddenly he hears a voice, "Let go." He yells back, "But I'll fall." The voice says again, "Let go." He looks down, afraid of what might happen, refusing to release. Eventually, exhaustion takes over. His fingers loosen. He lets go and falls a mere 2 feet, landing safely on solid ground. He was never in danger, just in fear. And fear is fueled by the illusion of control. We try to control because we're afraid of loss, afraid of chaos, afraid of uncertainty. But control is a seduction, a trap dressed as safety. And it never truly delivers. You plan every step, and still the road changes. You say all the right words, and still they leave. You do everything right, and still life does what life does. In Buddhism, this truth is called anicca, impermanence. Everything changes, everything shifts, everything moves, but we resist that law, fighting it like a wave we think we can freeze. Yet the more we resist, the more exhausted we become, because trying to control what's uncontrollable is like trying to hold water in your fists. The tighter you squeeze, the less you keep. The deepest irony, our attempts to control life don't actually bring peace, they only bring pressure. The pressure to predict, the pressure to prevent, the pressure to never let anything slip. And even when nothing goes wrong, we're still tense, because part of us is always waiting for the fall. That's not peace, that's prison. A prison built from what-ifs and should-haves. A prison built from fear of a tomorrow that hasn't even happened. Let's be honest, most of our suffering doesn't come from what is. It comes from what we thought should have been. We mourn futures that never happened. We punish ourselves for choices we didn't make. We live in arguments that only ever took place in our heads. That's the illusion. We think we're navigating the world, but often we're navigating our expectations of it. And when life doesn't meet those expectations, we call it failure. But maybe life was never off course. Maybe we were just too attached to a map, drawn in fear, not truth. Here's a radical thought. Maybe we don't need to control everything to feel safe. Maybe we just need to trust more deeply, not blind trust, but wise trust. A trust that understands impermanence. A trust that accepts what is and lets go of what isn't. The Buddha never taught us to control life. He taught us to understand it, and understanding begins when we stop grasping at outcomes and start resting in presence. You can't stop the storm, but you can stop standing in the rain, trying to hold back the clouds. Let go of needing everything to make sense. Let go of needing everyone to agree. Let go of the belief that your worth is tied to how much you control. Peace isn't found in having power over life. It's found in no longer needing to. When the mind no longer demands certainty, it becomes still. And in that stillness, a deeper kind of knowing arises, not the knowing of facts, but the knowing of truth, a truth that doesn't come from grasping, but from surrender. Letting go doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing what you can, with care, with clarity, and releasing your attachment to the result. You act, you show up, you speak honestly, and then you bow to the unfolding, because life isn't a machine, it's a mystery. And it wasn't meant to be mastered. It was meant to be met, moment by moment, breath by breath, without the burden of control. So ask yourself, what am I trying to control right now? What if I stopped? What would it feel like to soften, to trust, to let go just a little? You don't have to let go of everything today, but you can start with one thing, that one expectation. That keeps breaking your heart. That one plan you keep forcing even though it drains you. That one version of yourself you keep performing just to be loved. Set it down, not with anger but with mercy. Because sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is stop trying to be the architect of every outcome. When you stop clinging to control, you start holding space for life to move, and life has its own rhythm, one far more beautiful than anything we could have scripted. But to hear it, to feel it, to live in tune with it, we have to loosen our grip on what never really belonged to us. Not everything is yours to fix. Not everything is yours to carry. Not everything is meant to go as planned. And that's okay, because peace isn't found in getting everything right. It's found in being okay. When things go wrong, that is the lightness we've been searching for all along. And in that letting go, something else becomes possible, a kind of presence that leads us not just into freedom, but into silence, the kind of silence that holds wisdom. We live in a world that's addicted to sound, not just noise, but constant stimulation, notifications, conversations, debates, inner dialogues that never seem to end. It's as if silence makes us uncomfortable, as if the absence of noise is the presence of something threatening. But have you ever asked yourself, what exactly are we afraid to hear? When everything else goes quiet, most people think silence is nothingness, an absence, a void. But in truth, silence is full of insight, full of clarity, full of things that sound can never deliver. Silence doesn't mean the world stops moving. It means you stop reacting to every movement. It doesn't mean your thoughts disappear. It means they no longer shout over your wisdom. In silence, you don't become empty, you become aware. The human mind is often like a radio left on all day, constantly changing stations, rarely stopping long enough to hear what's beneath the static. But silence is the moment you finally turn the volume down, and what you begin to notice is that the noise wasn't just outside, it was inside too. The voice of doubt, the echo of regret, the replay of old arguments, the fear of not being enough. And when we're constantly surrounded by noise, we don't realize how much of it we've internalized. This is why Buddhist practice places such deep reverence on noble silence, not just the silence of lips, but the silence of ego, of judgment, of mental chatter, a silence where you stop performing, stop fixing, stop filling every gap with commentary, and simply be, because in silence, you don't disappear, you reappear, not the version of you that's trying to impress or prove, but the original you, the one before the noise. Think of how a muddy river clears. When left undisturbed, the water doesn't have to be filtered, it just has to be still. And slowly, the dirt settles to the bottom, Clarity returns, that's your mind, not broken, not lost, just stirred up. And silence is the stillness that allows truth to surface. But most people won't sit still long enough to see it, because silence also reveals what we've been avoiding, and that can be scary. When you first enter silence, you might not feel peace, you might feel chaos, the backlog of emotions rushing to the surface, the mind desperate to distract itself again. But stay, wait, breathe, because beneath the noise is not more noise, it's stillness. And in that stillness, you don't just hear peace, you become it. Many of us confuse activity with aliveness. We think we're doing well if we're constantly busy, constantly productive, constantly talking, but inner lightness doesn't come from more motion, it comes from less noise. You don't need more opinions, you need more space. You don't need to speak more truth, you need to sit more in truth. You don't need louder answers, you need quieter presence. And here's the paradox: silence isn't the absence of communication, it's the most honest form of it. When you sit with someone in silence, and there's no awkwardness, just presence, that's real connection. When you sit with your own thoughts and feel no urge to run away, that's self-trust. When you sit in the presence of the present moment and realize it's enough, that's awakening. You've probably noticed it before. The most powerful teachers speak the least, the most grounded monks radiate peace without words. Why? Because they've touched the depth that exists only in silence. Words can inspire, but silence transforms, because silence is not neutral, it's sacred. It's not what's left when everything else fails. It's what's been waiting behind the noise all along. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat with yourself and said nothing? Not even in your mind, just sat. Not to solve, not to achieve, but just to be. Most people fill silence because they fear what will rise inside it. But what rises is often exactly what needs to be healed. Silence holds that space, not to judge, but to welcome, not to fight, but to soften. Lightness doesn't come from solving every problem. It comes from seeing clearly what was never really a problem to begin with. The noise isn't who you are, it's just the weather passing through the sky. You are the sky. The thoughts, the worries, the voices, they come and go. But behind them, beneath them, there is a silence that has never left you. It has always been there, waiting. This is not just poetic, it's practical. Want clarity? Try silence. Want peace? Try silence. Want to hear your own intuition? Try silence. Even a few minutes a day can begin to shift the landscape of your mind, like sweeping dust from a temple floor. Every breath in silence is an offering to yourself, and the more you return to it, the lighter you become. Not because life changed, but because the noise no longer owns you. In this silence, we begin to touch something beyond intellect. Call it stillness, call it essence, call it Buddha nature, but it has no name. It's just this moment, without commentary. It's so simple that the noisy mind can't grasp it, but the heart remembers, and when you feel it, really feel it, you'll know why the sages smiled without ever saying a word. We've searched for freedom in all the wrong places, in control, in validation, in answers, but perhaps freedom was simply the moment you stopped talking and started listening, not to the world, but to the space beneath it, to the sacred silence inside your own being. That is the lightest sound of all. And in that quiet awakening, we begin to walk with a new kind of presence, one that doesn't need to be loud to be strong. Have you ever walked into a room with nothing in it and felt like you could finally breathe? There's something sacred about space, about simplicity, about having less, but being more. And yet, our modern lives are cluttered, not just with things, but with desires, expectations, attachments. We chase abundance, but rarely ask, abundance of what? We've been taught to fill the shelves of our homes and the corners of our hearts with more clothes, more opinions, more plans, more someday dreams. We never have time to live, and somehow, with every new possession, we lose a little space to feel, to notice, to simply exist. But Buddhism offers a different invitation, not to reject the world, but to free yourself from being owned by it. The Buddha once said, "You only lose what you cling to." Clinging isn't about love, it's about fear. The fear that without this object, this title, this relationship, will be empty. But true emptiness isn't hollow, it's spacious, like an open sky that welcomes every cloud without becoming one. When your heart is cluttered with what you think you need, you stop feeling what you actually are. Minimalism of the heart isn't just a lifestyle, it's a spiritual path. It's the practice of choosing what truly matters and releasing the rest. It's asking, does this bring me peace? Not just, does this bring me pleasure? It's learning to walk through life with open hands so that joy can enter without fear of being locked in. So that loss no longer feels like death, but like a gentle release. Think of all the things you hold onto that drain your energy, the grudge that clings to your pride, the memory you replay, as if suffering again will rewrite it. The identity you wear like armor, because being seen feels too raw. Letting go isn't weakness, it's making space. And when your heart has space, it becomes lighter, not because it carries less, but because it carries only what's true. Have you noticed how children laugh so easily? They own nothing, yet they feel everything. Every moment is an invitation to wonder. Why? Because their hearts aren't full of clutter. They haven't yet been told that owning equals meaning. They haven't yet confused possession with presence. Minimalism of the heart means asking hard questions. Do I need this story I keep telling myself? Do I need this fear of being misunderstood? Do I need this constant comparison? Or can I let them go and rediscover the quiet joy that exists beneath the noise? This is not about discarding your life. It's about distilling it so that what remains is real, alive, yours. You see, we think simplicity is boring, but in truth, it's radiant. A flower doesn't try to be 5 flowers, it just blooms fully. A bird doesn't hoard its songs, it sings when the moment is right. Simplicity isn't about having nothing, it's about needing less, so you can feel more. And when your heart isn't drowning in more, you begin to taste the subtle beauty of what's already here. In Zen, there's a phrase, when the cup is full, stop pouring. Yet most of us keep pouring, more projects, more validation, more goals, even when the cup spills over and soaks our peace. But minimalism of the heart is the art of knowing when to stop, not because you're done, but because you're full of presence, full of life, full of enough. So many spiritual traditions point to the same truth. We suffer not from lack, but from excess. Too many attachments, too many distractions, too many layers between who we are and who we pretend to be. And so the path is not more, it's less. Less grasping, less craving, less proving. Because the soul doesn't want everything, it just wants something real. Imagine your heart like a quiet room. What's in it? Is there space to sit and breathe? Or is every inch filled with the clutter of what-ifs, should-haves, and one-day-wins? To own less is not a sacrifice, it's a liberation. And what you gain is not emptiness, but intimacy with the moment, with your breath, with your true self. You begin to find that joy doesn't come from the next thing, it comes from the now thing, the scent of tea rising in steam, the sound of rain on your roof, the smile you didn't force, the silence that felt like home. None of it requires ownership, all of it requires presence. and presence can only exist in an uncluttered heart. So ask yourself, what if you owned less, but loved more? What if you expected less, but noticed more? What if you held less tightly, but lived more deeply? This is the wisdom of the minimalist heart, not a trend, not a design aesthetic, but a return to the essential, the quiet miracle of being fully here in this sacred spaciousness, where less becomes more. We don't lose ourselves. We find the version that was never weighed down in the first place. What if this moment was all you ever had? Not the next hour, not next year, not the second after this one, just now, right now. Would you live it differently? Would you breathe it more deeply? Would you taste the silence more slowly? Would you finally look into your own life and really see it? We spend most of our lives anywhere but here, caught in the gravity of what's gone or what's not yet come, replaying conversations like broken records, rehearsing futures that may never arrive. And yet, no amount of rethinking the past will change it. No amount of controlling the future will secure it. All we ever truly own is this fleeting, living breath we are taking now. But presence, true deep presence, is more than just being in the moment. It's being with the moment, fully, with your body, with your mind, with your heart. It's not resisting the now, not wishing it were different, not waiting for the next moment to be better. It's bowing to what is, exactly as it is, even if it's imperfect, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's fleeting. Buddhism doesn't ask us to escape reality. It invites us to enter it fully. Because suffering at its root is resistance to what is. We suffer not because of the pain, but because we want it gone. We suffer not because of the moment, but because we want it to be another one. But when we stop resisting, when we return to this breath, this sound, this sensation in our hands, we reconnect to something ancient and alive, the truth that life has always been here. We just haven't. A Zen master once poured tea for a student. The cup filled, then overflowed. Still, the master kept pouring. The student shouted, "Stop, it's full." And the master smiled. "Exactly, you are like this cup. How can I teach you when you're already full?" Presence begins when we stop pouring, when we empty the cup of expectation, judgment, and constant mental commentary. Then finally, we can taste the tea. Deep presence doesn't mean everything feels good. It means everything is welcome. Joy, grief, peace, frustration. Nothing needs to be pushed away. Nothing needs to be clung to, just witnessed, just held. Like a bird resting in your open palm. Not trapped, not chased, just gently received. But we've forgotten how to be present. Because we've forgotten how to be. We confuse motion with meaning, productivity with purpose, busyness with worth, and so we scroll, we swipe, we multitask, we rush from one thing to the next, trying to fit life in. But life doesn't fit in, it's already here, waiting, watching, breathing alongside us. It doesn't ask for your success, it asks for your presence. Imagine eating a single strawberry, in complete silence. No phone, no talking, no distraction, just you. The texture, the flavor, the moment, that strawberry becomes a universe. That second becomes a lifetime. This is deep presence. This is life tasted fully, instead of swallowed unconsciously. There is a reason. The Buddha placed so much emphasis on mindfulness. It's not just a mental technique. It's a return to yourself, to your breath, to the very fabric of this moment, unfolding in real time. The present isn't a place, it's a practice. You don't arrive at it once, you arrive again, and again, and again, until presence becomes your home. And here's the paradox. When you become fully present, you need less, you talk less, you want less, you even fear less, because you're no longer chasing. the next moment to be better. You're no longer living in a constant state of almost. Instead, you are simply here, and that is more than enough. When was the last time you truly listened to someone without forming your response in your head? When was the last time you walked without needing to go anywhere? When was the last time you let silence speak to you instead of trying to fill it? These are small acts of presence, but they are gateways to vast and sacred spaces within you. And slowly, your life begins to change, not because your circumstances change, but because your relationship to life transforms. You become less reactive, more patient, more grateful, more open. You stop missing your own life because you are finally here to witness it. That is the quiet miracle of deep presence. You begin to realize that nothing has to be perfect for it to be beautiful. The chipped mug, the wrinkled bedsheet, the rain-soaked morning, the tears you didn't hide, all of it belongs to the sacred now. And when you see clearly, when you're not lost in past or future, even the most ordinary moment can feel divine. The lighter the mind, the deeper the life, and the path to that depth doesn't lead away from the world. It leads deeper into this moment, this now, this breath, this living sacred now. And so we return again, not to find something new, but to finally meet what has always been waiting for us. In stillness, there's a kind of love that doesn't cling, a kind of compassion that holds everything, but holds nothing down. It moves through the world, like wind through open hands, gentle, wide, and free. Most of us were taught that to love means to worry, to grasp, to hold tightly. But what if real compassion isn't heavy? What if it's the very thing that lightens your heart and liberates others too? In the quiet spaces of Buddhist teachings, there is a concept that shatters most of what the world assumes. True compassion is without attachment. At first, it sounds cold, even unkind. How can you love without holding on? How can you care without clinging? But look deeper, and you'll see it's the most radical form of love. It's a love that doesn't possess, that doesn't need you to be different, that doesn't trap itself in expectation, fear, or control. It's a love that sets you free, and sets itself free too. When we attach to others, we begin to carry their emotions as our own. Their happiness becomes our responsibility. Their pain becomes our failure. We try to save them, fix them, own them, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of losing them, fear of not being enough, fear of letting go. But this isn't compassion. It's dependency dressed in love's clothing. And in time, it suffocates both giver and receiver. True compassion doesn't say, I need you to be okay so that I can feel okay. It says, I see your suffering, I walk with you in it, and I trust in your path, as I trust in mine. It's the presence of an open heart, without the weight of emotional ownership. It's the deepest form of respect. I am with you, but I do not own your journey. In Buddhism, this form of boundless compassion is known as karuna. Karuna is not reactive. It doesn't rush to fix. It doesn't panic in the presence of pain. Instead, it listens. It breathes. It stays. And in that sacred stillness, something profound happens. The other feels seen, not managed, not solved, but seen. And being seen, truly seen, is often more healing than anything else. But how do we love? Without attaching. How do we care? Without carrying too much. We begin by learning to stand in our own center, stable, aware, whole. From this inner stillness, we can open our arms without losing our balance. We can walk beside others without losing ourselves, because compassion without attachment is rooted in wisdom. Wisdom knows everyone must walk their path, no matter how much we love them. We cannot walk it for them. A parent can guide a child, but not think their thoughts. A friend can offer comfort, but not erase another's grief. A healer can offer tools, but cannot walk into another's wounds for them. This is the bittersweet truth of life, but also its beauty, because when we let go of trying to control another's journey, we make space for trust. And trust is where love breathes best. But beware, this path takes courage. To love like this means accepting impermanence. It means holding someone in your heart, even as they change, drift, or leave. It means not confusing presence with possession, and it means softening into the truth that love is not measured by how tightly we hold on, but by how freely we let it flow. Look at the sun. It touches everything, warms everything, but it clings to nothing. Its gift is complete presence, not possession. Real compassion is like that, radiant, unconditional, unattached. The Buddha once said, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, so should one cultivate a boundless heart toward all beings. But even a mother must one day let the child go, to love without fear, to give without needing something back, to hold space without holding control. This is karuna. This is lightness through compassion. And there's more. When we release the weight of attachment, we discover something miraculous. We can love more, not less, because we are no longer exhausted by fear, by control, by grasping. Our love becomes expansive, peaceful, restorative. We can sit with a stranger's sorrow without absorbing it. We can hold a friend's heartbreak without losing our own breath. We can witness suffering in the world without becoming paralyzed by it, because we understand our job is not to carry the world. It is to open our heart so wide that the world can walk through it. This is not detachment, it's non-attachment. Detachment is closing the heart. Non-attachment is keeping it open. But free, it's love without chains, care without burden, closeness without collapse. And in this space, we become the kind of presence that heals by simply being present. Imagine a world where people loved without clinging, gave without expectation, helped without self-interest. That world starts not with grand gestures, but with a single shift, from attachment to attunement, from grasping to grace, from tightness to lightness. In learning to love this way, you don't become less connected. You become boundlessly connected, because real compassion doesn't need to own. In order to care, it doesn't need to hold tight. In order to hold sacred, it simply flows from the heart that knows. The lighter the love, the deeper it reaches. There is a silence so vast, so complete, that when you enter it, you don't hear anything. You become the silence. You don't just feel light. You become lightness itself. And in that space, the mind does not search. The heart does not grasp. The soul simply rests. This is the silence of wisdom, a wisdom that doesn't live in words, but in direct seeing. And what it sees is the most liberating truth of all. Nothing stands alone. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is truly separate. We call this truth emptiness. But don't be fooled by the word. Emptiness doesn't mean nothing exists. It means nothing exists independently. A flower is not just a flower. It's sunshine, soil, rain, time, space, and countless unseen causes. Look at your own hand. It's not just your hand. It holds your parents, your ancestors, the food you ate, the breaths you've taken, the earth that nourished every cell. You are not a separate being. You are a vast web of conditions, momentarily gathering into a form called you. This is the teaching of interbeing. You don't just live in the world lives in you. And when you truly see that, something astonishing happens. The weight of the self begins to dissolve. That anxious voice that says, "This is mine, that is yours, this must not change," softens. That desperate grip to control, to define, to defend, fades, because when nothing is truly separate, there is no solid thing to protect. no rigid ego to uphold, no boundary where you end. And life begins. This is not nihilism. It's not the cold belief that nothing matters. It's the radiant freedom that everything matters. Because everything is connected. You are not isolated. You are infinite in relation. And in that understanding, you no longer carry the burden of being someone, of proving something, of guarding your identity. Like a fortress, you become light, not because you are empty of meaning, but because you are empty of separateness. You are free. The Buddha did not teach emptiness as a theory to memorize. He taught it as a doorway to peace, because most of our suffering comes not from life itself, but from the illusion that things must stay the same, that people belong to us, that roles define us, that I must be in control. But the nature of reality is constant change, unfolding, dissolving, arising again. Trying to grasp what cannot be held is the very source of our heaviness. But when we see clearly, see that all things are impermanent, interdependent, and not self, we stop struggling against life. We start flowing with it. So what does lightness look like? Through the lens of this wisdom, it looks like not taking things personally, because there's no solid person to defend. It looks like letting go more easily, because nothing is truly yours to own. It looks like compassion without judgment, because you see your suffering in everyone else. It looks like joy without clinging, because you know joy is a wave, not a possession. And it looks like peace, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances staying perfect. Peace that comes from no longer being trapped in illusion. This is the paradox of emptiness. When you let go of the idea that you are a fixed self, you don't vanish, you expand, like air in all directions, like light in every space. The tighter we hold onto me, the heavier life becomes. The more we see through that illusion, the more we begin to float, not above the world, but within it, fully, lovingly, wisely. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nh letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH, once held up a single sheet of paper and said, "If you look deeply into this paper, you can see the cloud floating in it. Without the cloud, there would be no rain. Without the rain, the trees cannot grow. Without the trees, we cannot have paper. So the cloud is in this paper. You are the cloud. You are the rain. You are not just a person. You are a process, a miracle of causes and conditions, dancing for a brief, beautiful while. Knowing this, how could we take life so personally? Why would we carry the burden of I, me, mine, when we could rest in the freedom of this is and it's enough? Letting go of ego is not a loss. It is a return to something older than identity, deeper than opinion, more spacious than belief. It is the return to presence, undefended, open, still. From this place, we can meet life, not as something to conquer, but as something to join. And the moment we join it fully, without barrier, without bias, we become light, not because we are untouched by life, but because we are untangled by it. This is why in the deepest teachings, wisdom and compassion are not separate, because when you see that nothing stands alone, you stop fighting others, you stop fearing difference, you stop dividing the world into right and wrong, us and them. You begin to live as the world itself, and that is lightness, not as a fleeting mood, but as the natural state of awakened being. So remember, emptiness isn't the absence of life, it's the absence of separation. And when you stop standing apart from the world, you begin to feel it move through you. You stop being a fixed identity and become a living presence, free of weight, full of wonder. And in that state, you no longer ask, "Who am I?" You simply breathe. And the answer is the breath itself. So, here we are, not at the end of something, but at the beginning of something deeper, not another chapter to read, but a moment to live. You didn't come all this way just to learn how to feel lighter. You came to remember what was always inside you, the stillness beneath the noise, the spaciousness behind the thoughts, the freedom that doesn't arrive because it never left. A deep life doesn't mean doing more. It means being more awake, more honest, more here, because the light mind we've spoken of is not just an airy concept. It's a way of being, a way of breathing without bracing, a way of walking without rushing, a way of seeing others without separating yourself from them. It is the life that comes when the self is no longer a prison and the moment is no longer a stepping stone, when now is enough. Let's not forget what we've uncovered. We saw that the mind feels heavy because it clings to control, to roles, to noise, to past and future. We learned that letting go isn't giving up, but opening up. That silence isn't empty, it's full of truth. That minimalism of the heart isn't about owning nothing, but being owned by nothing. That presence is not a technique, but a way of remembering who you are. Beneath the distractions, that compassion can flow freely without needing to possess. And that wisdom is not found in more information, but in emptiness, the space where everything is connected. So now what's next? Nothing flashy, nothing grand, just this breath, just this moment, just this quiet miracle of being alive. Because the real teaching is not in words. It's in how you walk to the kitchen. It's in how you speak to a stranger. It's in how you sit with your own pain without flinching. It's in how you let go of what doesn't serve you again and again, not because it's easy, but because you're free to. The lighter the mind, the deeper the life. Not deep like complexity, not deep like drama, but deep like the ocean, still vast and present. You don't need to change your life. You need to show up for it as it is, as you are, no longer weighed down by what you thought you needed to be. There is a great simplicity on the other side of seeking, not laziness, not indifference, but a grounded joy. That doesn't need a reason. That doesn't need to be explained. A peace that doesn't disappear just because things get messy. You carry it now, not as an idea, but as a way of being, as a quiet flame that doesn't shout, but never goes out. So walk on gently, lightly, deeply, not because life is light, but because you are. You know now that you were never meant to carry the world, only to meet it. Open-hearted, soft-handed, and unafraid. Let the world keep rushing. You don't have to. Let others build walls. You can remain open. Let life unfold, not as something to control, but as something to join, not heavy, not hollow, just here, just this. And if anyone ever asks what you learned from this path, smile gently and say nothing, because the deepest truths don't need to be spoken. They only need to be lived.